about at the beginning of this year in January. It was a fast-paced study, and we're very thankful to many of the stakeholders who are in the room who have collaborated, contributed to this output. So we had several touch points, starting from the launch to the consultation and key format interviews. And I think we finally reached an output which reflects the collective wisdom of all the stakeholders, which included government partners, development partners, bilateral donors, some think tanks and academia as well. So it's a great pleasure today to present to you the findings of this finalized report and also share your, get your comments and feedback. This is a good blueprint which can help Pakistan move forward in the right direction. So we'll be presenting the findings. There will be detailed session. There will be also, seeking your feedback and comments on the key issues. But now to formally kick off, the opening session, I would first like to invite Mr. Bilal Anwar, Chief Executive Officer, National Disaster Risk Management Fund, to provide his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Khalid. Bilal Khalid. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Abbas Jah to Pakistan and other colleagues from the World Bank who have actually come and gathered for this particular launch today. And we're very pleased from NDRMF to be part of today's launch. And the reason being this kind of a work, this kind of assessment, this is a kind of a very practical and noble way where the government partners can actually come together and based and building on their international and regional experience and expertise, and they can apply these techniques and methodologies and actually identify the gaps across the board. But especially we are in a situation, especially in Pakistan, where the crisis preparedness is one of those fundamental requirements. Now, although in Pakistan, for crisis or disaster preparedness or disaster risk reduction or climate adaptation, I mean, all these are so much interlinked and interdependent areas. What a tremendous amount of work has already been achieved, especially on institutional fronts. A number of new institutions have evolved over the period of time, although it's a painful kind of effect as well that every new institution, every new entity, every new initiative actually originated out of one type of crisis or the other, whether it be an earthquake or it could be a mega flood or it's going to be a pandemic or anything like this. But then, nevertheless, I mean, I think we have learned over the period, and this kind of a work, this kind of exercise actually provide this kind of a framework where a preemptive action, an ex ante, and preparedness can be very effectively integrated into the work of different entities. So in Pakistan, there's an awful lot of work still to be done. And because we are a disaster-prone country, we happen to be geographically located where the climate change actually plays this role quite significantly, almost on a year-in, year-out basis. And if we are not into the floods, we are facing a heat wave. If we are not in the heat wave, we are passing through some kind of, the country is passing through some kind of a drought in one part of the country or the other. So this is people you call it, it's a new normal, although it may not be a very right way of interpreting it or justifying it, because any kind of a disaster, any kind of calamity should not become a normal. And you cannot eliminate it, you cannot avoid it. But now with the technologies, with the policy measures, and with the preemptiveness and the preparedness, we can definitely prepare ourselves better, and we can definitely minimize the impact of the different disasters. So this is the work, especially. I think this is going to be this has identified the areas where the further work is to be done. It has identified the gaps, which clearly shows that those gaps need to be addressed through policy measures, through technological solutions, through coordination, and better and effective working together for different institutions. And so this is where we have to basically take it forward, and we have to integrate into our own work processes, into our own action plans. If you quickly go through the report, you'll see that National Disaster Risk Management Fund is there. And there's a number of responsibilities and areas which have been directly identified to the work of NDRMF. And we're not surprised about that. This is a kind of a work, this is kind of the areas which we have identified ourselves as well. And we have been actually preparing with the support and the consultation with our government partners on how to prepare ourselves and how to position ourselves. Um, we have just come up with a disaster risk financing strategy, which has been approved by the board, and we are right now into the implementation, the early implementation phase of the strategy. This is going to be very first time in Pakistan. Is going to be kind of unpacking and implementing some of the innovative disaster risk financing instruments. So effectively, it is going to be transferring some of the burden, the financial burden, the fiscal burden from the government to the other instruments which we are going to be designing, and will be designing those instruments with the support with a number of stakeholders, including the bank and the other stakeholders as well. Similarly, the risk modeling and the risk quantification, risk assessment, I think no one can deny the importance of it. While no one can deny it, we know that this is such a fundamental gap in Pakistan. No coordinated effort or action has been actually so far undertaken when kind of a mechanism or setup can be established where the risk assessment can actually take place. So NDRMF have actually taken this a bold step, and we have set up this natural catastrophic model, NatCat, and which is functional and operational now, and it is housed in the NURST, in an academic institution. And now we are in a position where we can actually undertake the risk assessment, the quantification, and can model out the different kind of the disaster and crisis scenarios, and come up with kind of a realistic impacts on different sectors. So it can actually undertake a multi-hazard, multi-sectoral aspects and multi assessments and quantification. And it has quite a broad runtime as well for different kind of disasters as well, which gives us a realistic picture for the future ahead. So this is not about a prediction, it's not about a forecast, this is about the risk assessment. So I think that the difference is quite automatically forgotten. And we have actually we have dedicated ourselves for the risk assessment and risk quantification rather than forecasting and the prediction, which other agencies are doing this work quite fundamentally. Now, some ground has been covered, but there's still quite a tremendous amount of work which is still needed to be done. And thank you very much for the World Bank to undertake this study. The recommendations and the findings, we are owning that. We are going to be taking those findings and integrating into our own work items and work processes. And this gives us an opportunity to work a lot more collaboratively and coordinated fashion. So thank you very much. And you'll be hearing about the report, and I'm sure you'll be finding it a lot more educational and information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khalsa. It is a great pleasure to have Mr. Abbas Jah joining us for today's launch event. He is the World Bank South Asia Practice Manager for Infrastructure Resilience Policy and Finance Unit. And keeping in line with his deep passion for technology and digital solutions, he will be speaking about the role of technology in crisis preparedness and response.
Assalamu alaikum. How's everyone today? So it's great always to come back to Pakistan, and I'm really pleased to be here at this CPGA launch. And most of you probably know what the CPGA is, but I'll just give a very quick kind of a 30-second summary, which is that many of you will be familiar with the IDA, the International Development Association, which is a highly concessional lending arm of the World Bank. So by a rule of thumb, about 60% of IDA is a grant. So obviously Pakistan accesses IDA. So every 3 years, the IDA funds are replenished by the donors. And we are currently in the IDA 20 cycle, so the 20th cycle of IDA. So as part of the IDA 20 requirements, the donors require that each country accessing IDA prepare the CPGA, which is the Crisis Preparedness Gap Analysis. The thinking behind that was that we are in, as Bilal Saab mentioned, we are in an era of what is called polycrisis. So it's not just one crisis hitting, but multiple crises hitting at the same time. So the donors required that each country prepare this crisis preparedness gap analysis. So first of all, I want to really thank my team that has led this, Yoko, Bilal, Amna, and many others. I'm sorry that I cannot name everyone, but we had colleagues from health, from environment, and transport. So this was very much a multi-sectoral effort. So first of all, thank you very much to the team. Now, I want to focus my very brief comments on 3 or 4 key issues. So the first is that we are now living in a world which is described as VUCA. Have you heard the term VUCA? How many of you? Raise your hand if you've heard VUCA. Okay, so not too many. Okay, VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So in 2010, there was a very seminal paper, technical paper published in the journal Science. And the headline of that paper was "Stationarity is Dead." And what that meant was that in statistics, stationarity means that you assume that the past probability will be the same as present. That word no longer exists. I was talking to the mayor of Ho Chi Minh City a few years ago, and he told me that when we designed, for example, the drainage system, by the time that drainage system is built, it's already obsolete. You design for a peak rainfall of say 100 millimeters, that's already exceeded. Let me give you 2 startling statistics. The city of Zhengzhou in China in 2021, in the span of 24 hours, got more rainfall than they get in a year. In Sindh, in the 2022 floods, Sindh got 700% more rainfall than its average. The reason I'm mentioning these statistics is that there is no infrastructure system in the world, however well designed, that can withstand this kind of extreme weather events. And we are increasingly in this new age. The last time that the carbon concentration in the atmosphere was above 400 ppm parts per million was when dinosaurs were roaming the planet. Human beings have never been in this paradigm. So we are completely in a new paradigm. And our systems, our governance, our administration, our policy making, none of it is designed for this. So we need to really rethink our approach. So in that respect, let me just suggest 3 or 4 major points. So first is that obviously Pakistan is the world's 5th most populous country, and it is also one of the most vulnerable to climate change. The 2022 floods was not an aberration, but unfortunately, this is, as I said, the world we are living in. So in terms of the CPGA recommendation, the first, I think, priority should be to harmonize the legislative framework. There are too many overlapping laws and which need urgently to be updated and to have one sort of comprehensive framework for crisis response and management. So that's first. I think Pakistan needs to operationalize its disaster management plans. Often, and I'm not singling out Pakistan at all. This is a problem across many countries, which is that the disaster management plans remain on paper. So they really need to have a robust way of implementing it and also updating it based on experiences. The third is, and we were just discussing with Bilal Saab, is that we need a comprehensive disaster risk financing framework. And this is not just about innovative products like cat bonds, which are often not very suitable for emerging markets like Pakistan. But instead of fixing the nuts and bolts of, for example, your disaster relief system, and again, the World Bank would be very, very happy to partner with the NDRMF on this issue. The fourth lesson that we have learned, and which is I think very urgent for Pakistan, is the need for coordination, better coordination between the national, states, and local government levels. They really need to work in synchronicity. And fifth is that investing in early warning systems. So the World Bank has done multiple studies which show that investing in hydromet services and early warning systems is perhaps the best investment that any country can make. We have found that $1 invested in these systems can save $8 to $10 later and avoided costs. And here again, in Pakistan, this is an urgent need. Now, Bilal mentioned the other Bilal, this is our Bilal, uh, mentioned that my interest in technology. So I do believe that technology is a great enabler, but I do want to give a word of caution, which is that often we get attracted by shiny new objects, this Doppler radar here, or AI, ML. Technology is just a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It should solve problems for real people. So in that context, I do feel that the better use of technology could be a game changer for Pakistan. So let me give you a few examples. So one is the multi-hazard vulnerability risk assessments. If we can digitize this data and then make it freely available in an open platform, for example, that would enable the policymakers to make more informed, data-driven decisions. And I do want to commend the NDRMF for uh, um, the data set that they have set up, NatCat, I believe it's called, with Sparko. So that's a really good beginning. I think the most exciting developments that are happening right now is on AI and ML. And let me give you one concrete example of that. So often in emerging markets, you'll find that the very high resolution satellite imagery is not available. So let's say you want to 10 centimeter resolution satellite maps. Those are often not available in our countries. What AI and ML allows you to do is you can take a 5-meter resolution satellite map and downscale it, even without the granular data, to a much more finer resolution. And it's very cheap, very cost effective. So, for example, the European Space Agency is running a number of pilots. And by the way, if you're interested in this, we have a partnership with the European Space Agency and we can help you make that connection. Second example I would give is using AI for flood forecasting. So Google is running 2 very interesting pilots, one in Bangladesh and one in India, where they do not need detailed topography or bathymetric data, and they are making flood forecasts without this data, which is as good as detailed 3D topographic map flood forecast. So again, this could be a game changer because it would be much more cost effective. I think the Internet of Things is a very interesting phenomenon. You are getting these low cost sensors, which will send back data, which again enables you to make better decisions. And the last thing I would mention here is the last mile connectivity. I often say that one of the least reported development stories in the world, which is perhaps the most impressive, one of the most impressive, is the reduction of deaths in cyclones in Bangladesh and India. Many of you may recall that in 1971, super cyclone Bhola hit Bangladesh, and about 1 million people died in that. Now, if the same intensity cyclone hits them, then perhaps no one will die. And the reason for that is that they have invested heavily in early warning systems, multi-purpose cyclone shelters. But the real key there is the last mile connectivity. They have very, very good ways of wanting the community to get out of harm's way. So I think that is really a game changer. So let me stop here. I really look forward to the discussions, and we would very much like to hear your thoughts on how can we take the CPGA forward to enhance Pakistan's crisis preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abbas. So with this, we will now start moving towards the core agenda of today's event. And I will request my colleague Amna Mehmet to provide the opening session on the CPG itself, which will focus on the development process and what the tool is about, which will then be followed by a more deeper dive into the various sections of the report. So over to Amna.
So good morning, Assalamualaikum. I'm Amna Mehmet. I'm the lead coordinator for this report. I'm going to present an overview of the CPGA methodology and process, following which my team, the CPGA team, will present gaps and recommendations that have arisen. Am I? So just a brief overview. These are just a few in the spirit of jarring statistics. Like Abbas just mentioned, Pakistan is the 5th most populous country in the world, and these are these are numbers from the 2023 census, so we already probably have surpassed this. In addition to this, 40% of children under 5 suffer from stunted growth. Stunting leads to a lifetime of cognitive and physical difficulties, leading to a lot of people then lagging behind in a lot of areas of their life, including economic and social. Another thing that is a challenge in Pakistan's context is that 40% of our labor force is engaged in agriculture. This is even more pronounced in rural areas, as 61% of Pakistan's overall population lives in rural areas, and 2 out of 3 women who are employed in the agriculture sector. So if you have a shock such as the 2022 floods, which directly affects the agricultural sector, a very large segment of the population is affected very badly. In addition to this, there's a 14.1% poverty rate, which Pakistan was making progress on poverty reduction prior to maybe 2018, but this is the same figure as 2018. The poverty rate has not increased since then because of COVID-19, because of the 2022 floods. In addition, we now have 7 million more Pakistanis living below the poverty line. And we have another figure that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, the 20 million children out of school figure. Now it's 25.37 million children, according to the latest census. So it's getting worse. So these challenges that already exist in our context are exacerbated by crises, such as the 2022 floods, such as COVID-19, earthquakes, any shocks. So we all know these figures. 33 million people were affected by the 2022 floods, and in addition, you already have so many children out of school, and more than 17,000 education institutes were affected by the floods. 42% of the population lives in moderately to severely food insecure households, which is exacerbated by what we're all experiencing these days: inflation and climate shocks and shocks such as health crises. In COVID-19, even though Pakistan was a leader in overcoming this crisis, we still had over 30,000 reported casualties, something which was obviously a big challenge for our already overstretched healthcare system. So this just illustrates how crises just exacerbate the issues we're already facing. From the CPGA, from the analysis that we conducted over the past few months, we observed that there were a few cross-sectoral challenges in crisis preparedness that you can identify maybe in any sector that we try to analyze from the lens of crisis preparedness. So even though I'm sure a lot of you here are people who've been working since even before 2005 on crisis preparedness and response, and you must have noticed how Pakistan's capabilities to prepare for and respond to crises have improved over the years, actually. I mean, if you compare maybe the 2005 earthquake to the 2022 floods, you will see a difference in our understanding of risk, in our response to crises, and how different institutions come together to respond. So even though there has been improvements, and we have a lot of legal and institutional mechanisms covering preparedness and response. We have our plans, we have the National Disaster Management Plan, we have sectoral plans, we have robust contingency planning done prior to every monsoon season, for example. There are still some on-ground implementation challenges. For example, there is weak institutional capacity, including human resource gaps in training. Sometimes there's a lack of clarity of mandate. It's not clear which organization, which institution is supposed to be doing exactly what during a disaster. We're also not clear sometimes on the reporting line, so there's an inadequate national and subnational coordination. For example, we're not always clear on the coordination between NDMA, PDMAs, how do they all report to each other? And lastly, there's also gaps in dedicated financing. So while there is financing that is dedicated, that when there is a crisis, you end up diverting funds, you don't have any ring fencing prior to a crisis, especially within different sectors. So for example, the education sector might not have dedicated financing, so that if there is a crisis, they can use those funds. So usually they have to then use their own budget to do this. So the result of all of this is that crisis response is often a mixture of coordinated response and ad hoc measures. So you will have some planned response, we'll have some contingency plans that will be put into place. There are some district disaster management plans that will be put into place. But because there are all of these challenges, a lot of ad hoc measures also have to be taken. So I mean, it ends up being a bit chaotic. So this is where the CPDA comes in. The CPDA is a policy priority for the World Bank Group. These are just an overview of what it is exactly. So the CPDA analyzes the capacity of country systems to prepare for and manage the impacts of crises. So the focus is on three kinds of crises: natural hazards, public health emergencies, and food insecurity. So this is not an all-encompassing exercise. We are focusing very specifically on three types of crises. So it provides a holistic and high-level view of crisis preparedness. It's not super micro level. You have the reports on your tables, and you might find that there are some areas that you might want to explore further upon reading this. It has mainstream crisis preparedness into country programming because we identify priority gaps, priority recommendations where you can maybe come in and implement things. So this is especially helpful for donor implementation or implementation by multilateral bodies such as the bank. So there's also a living crisis preparedness and response certificate of the World Bank. So the CPJ can provide a framework to access opportunities. Under this, you can find more details in the briefing note before you. So I mean, there are innovative tools under the crisis preparedness and response toolkit, which the CPJ can identify different areas where you could, use those tools. So I mean, we already covered this, that it provides entry points for dialogue with clients, with the government. And it's already been completed in several countries, so Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, for example. So this is an ongoing thing which is going to happen. So this is an overview of the actual framework and methodology. So this PDA is structured around 5 components. These are the components. Corresponding to foundational elements of crisis preparedness. So this is based on the work of the World Bank, the technical expertise, lessons learned from working with the government. So these have been carefully identified, these 5 areas. So each component, the way the exercise works is very much methodical, sorry. So each component is broken down into subcomponents and indicators. So there were guiding questions, you had to answer questions in maturity levels. Each question had a different weight, so it's a very it's also slightly, as you will see ahead, it's also slightly quantitative exercise. This whole exercise helped us identify points for supporting crisis preparedness. So I mean, the outputs from this exercise are for either the briefing note or the technical analysis. The briefing note is a much summarized version that is a good overview actually of the whole exercise and the recommendations. For more details. So this was also a highly consultative process. A lot of people in the group carefully were actually part of this process. So it began with an analytical review, kickoff workshop, then over the course of about a month and a half, we carried out 3 informative interviews with a lot of people here. So it was a very consultative process, and then we had a validation workshop, following which we have our output. So over 75 stakeholders across 39 different bodies, which are listed here, were consulted for this. So it was a highly collaborative and highly consultative process. So this is sort of the meat of what the output is. So this identifies the maturity levels of key components and subcomponents within the analysis. If you want to see this in more detail, you can find it on page 7 of the briefing note because it might not see this. So you have all of these components, the 5 components, and within those there are subcomponents. And then each subcomponent has, through the analysis, been given a maturity level. So you have 5 maturity levels ranging from unmet to advanced. Unmet means still nothing has been done. For example, legal institutional foundations. So on the legislative framework, strategic plans and policies, Pakistan actually scored good because we do have a lot of plans and policies and they're quite well formulated. And for example, we have crisis-induced displacement. Pakistan is the scoring was unmet because we've done little to nothing to address crisis-induced displacement, especially for already displaced groups and refugees. So these are the different levels. Unmet needs, nothing has been done. Basic needs, maybe something has been done, but it hasn't been operationalized. There's little to no follow through. There is a focus on ex post response instead of being proactive. Basic needs, you might have some land policies, but again, little follow through. Sometimes there's follow through, sometimes there isn't. Good means that you have landed policy, you have good proactive preparedness. There is still a focus on response, but there is no focus on being proactive. So advanced means that you might be a leader actually, regionally or internationally in that area. So I mean, this will further clarified as we move on and we delve into different sections. That will explain that will actually have quantification and you will be able to see how this came about. So I was saying this, we also speaking this prior to presenting the entry points. So we identified entry points or recommendations for the 5 components. All of the entry points are critical. So I just want to preface by saying that they're all critical actions. None of them are not critical, which is why you see a high and a medium, but the more still low. So they were further classified according to the level of readiness and priority according to this matrix. So we've identified them as being, so we have priority levels and readiness levels. High readiness means that we have good readiness to implement this action already. So we're well prepared. We can go into it. It needs immediate action. It's a critical gap. So we need to dive into it right now. So medium readiness means you might need some more dialogue with the client, you might need some more dialogue amongst yourselves, you might need to define it to be ready for it. So high priority means it needs immediate action. There's a critical gap, you need to prevent additional risks, you need to act now. And medium priority means you need action to address the gaps, but maybe you can put after the high priority actions. So this is a matrix. So I mean, so we're not talking about maybe this is important and this isn't important. This is just a smaller sequencing prioritization. So I think right now we're actually breaking for tea, and then after the tea break, we will have my sector colleagues will delve into each section and the gaps identified and the recommendations that we come up with. So we will do a deep dive after this. So I think he's somewhere there. I think so I think we'll come back in 30 minutes.
Very interesting. You would just be there for 6 months. So I don't know if you were there. Yes. Okay, great. So did you, you might have met my predecessor, Sandy.
Yeah, because the top of the last night, that was no. Yes. No. So they just like. It's fine.
I mean, firstly, I think it's just so important to have And there's still some less beliefs maybe we're still playing as well. Like I can be very academic. And it's like three girls, and my husband's on the team.
अच्छा it's like doctor but he probably went out for yeah he's actually well okay probably went out for us everyone should be like at this point I even stopped at what he wrote by them but the day highway expressive I'm एकदम पूछता भी नहीं
Can I bother you for a quick piece of picture basically?
Sure.
Thank you.
You want a portrait or landscape?
Both. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. That should be all right. Thank you.
Sure, I'm gonna carry on. I'll see you in a minute.
structure, like, this is boring. It might affect-
It's so nice to meet you. But then,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. Hello, sir.
But they don't know, so it's not your jurisdiction. Not never. Also, no, they can't.
We are also doing this water. Living in this.
But that one. I think the research over there, like.
We have to.
So we will get started for the deep dives into the section. So if everybody could come back to their seats, and we will get started. Okay, so I think in the past sessions, we had an overview of what the crisis preparedness gap analysis is and the tool itself. So just as a quick reminder, we'll now walk you through the 5 different sections of the report, starting with legal and institutional foundations. Okay, so I think this has been alluded to already in the opening and the overview session. But Pakistan actually does have a very robust and sound legislative framework and planning instruments. We're all familiar with the National Disaster Management Plan, which is the overarching framework for disaster risk management. But in addition, there are a lot of hazard-specific plans. We all know the monsoon contingency planning that is done every year at the national level and also at the provincial levels. There are many hazard-specific plans, including for heat now, for example, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. However, there is a lack of disaster management plans and clarity on roles at the subnational level. We have a kind of more deep dive in the technical annex on how this actually played out in the 2022 floods. So even though there is a robust standard operating procedure, a law that defines, what will happen under the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Act of 2010, In practice, the coordination, especially between the national and provincial levels, continue to remain a challenge. And thirdly, the operational, financial, human resource and monitoring challenges do hinder crisis preparedness. And of course, this is not something unique to Pakistan, and it is a very difficult and complex issue across disaster management in many countries. However, I think one big gap, which my colleague will dive into in the section on financial preparedness, is a lack of a financing strategy for many of the activities that are outlined in the plans. So even though the plans do exist on paper and operating budget, and then the human resources, of course, who need to take these activities forward are often missing and rely on donor funding. And of course, the 22 floods was it was a catastrophic disaster, but did really provide very important lessons on, what are the gaps in Pakistan's current structure. I think compared to the 2005 Muzaffarabad earthquake and the 2010 floods, you have seen a lot of progress in how the country deals with disaster risk management. That being said, now that there are operating the National Disaster Management Authority and the PDMAs, all of these structures at the local levels, how can we really be, coordinating better to ensure effective delivery, especially at the response stage? So this is the scoring that we saw in the circle a few slides before, but you can see the legislative framework, strategic plans and policies Pakistan scored good. The country does have a very good framework. And the governance and institutions also scores basic. So overall, legal and institutional foundations, what we found is that the foundations are there. However, the question is on how can we be operationalizing them, removing some redundancies and making sure there's clarity on roles and responsibilities. I'm not sure if you can see from where you're sitting, but this is the kind of matrix on the right corner in the bottom on readiness and priorities. So if you look at the key entry points on the left, they are all colored. So the ones that have high readiness and high priority are the kind of blue teal color. The ones that have readiness at a medium level but are of higher priority are orange. The ones that have readiness at a high level, but the priority is not as high, is green. And ones where the priority and readiness are both moderate are in the gray color. So for the legal and institutional foundations, the key entry point, the first one up there, is to update the National Disaster Management Act of 2010 and strengthen the National Disaster Management Plan to clarify roles, responsibilities, and coordination mechanisms. So with thanks to many of the stakeholders who gave inputs on this aspect, one really important point that came up through this analysis is the overlap between the National Disaster Management Act of 2010 and actually the very much older West Pakistan National Calamities Act of 1958. And these together have overlapping kind of directions on, for example, on how to declare emergencies, what defines calamity affected. And provinces such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa have gone and done an amendment to remove these redundancies. But we think that, of course, this needs to be done at the other provincial levels, but also at the national level. So there's more clarity on, what is the SOP to follow in the event of a disaster. The second recommendation is to operationalize the disaster risk management framework at the national, provincial, and district levels with clear financing strategies. So this has been repeated again and again, but one aspect we would recommend, especially along with the next recommendation on creating multi-year timeframe national disaster management plans, is to have a proper M&D framework. So I think that, the plan has a lot of very good and critical activities, but it's not clear how much is being budgeted, what has been done, so that when we go and make the next one, sometimes we're not sure, how are we doing on some of these very critical actions. And lastly, of course, to form partnerships between disaster management institutions and research technical institutions. I think that, one thing that we do know from doing this exercise in our engagements is that there is a lot of knowledge and technical, expertise within the country, but sometimes there is a matter of coordination and bringing everybody together to make sure that not just from a policy level, but all of the kind of technical expertise that exists in the country, that they're actually being brought in and coordinated in a very time-effective manner, so that, people are not scrambling at the time of a disaster to gather everybody, so that there's a working kind of partnership, whether it's MOUs or technical working committee, some kind of formalized structure is recommended. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Astrid, who will go through the next section on understanding and monitoring risks. And each of the presenters here are sector specialists from the World Bank. This whole exercise, I would add, was done in-house with all of the sector specialists, along with consultation with all of you and the various technical agencies, departments, and the government institutions, as well as donors. So over to Astrid.
Thank you, Yoko, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad, and I have the privilege of working on this pillar with my colleague Lisa and the rest of the CPGA core team as well. So this section is the largest one in the report, so I'll do my best to summarize it to the best of my abilities over the next 5 or so minutes. So this pillar mainly has two main components. One is risk assessment, and the second one is risk monitoring and early warning. So in terms of risk assessment, the government does exhibit an understanding of the geographical distribution of hazards, but there's a lack of comprehensive national level risk assessment and sector specific risk assessment. So in terms of understanding the distribution of hazards, you have in the National Disaster Management Plans, the latest one, you can see which risk districts or which provinces, what is their, what kind of disasters are they prone to. And especially when I'm talking about sector specific risk assessments, I mean, in terms of the two sections that we're looking at in terms of health and food security. The National Catastrophe Model recently launched by the NDRMF. It represents a significant advancement for DRM and has the potential to bolster national risk assessments in the future as well. And it's also important to talk about in terms of risk assessment that we looked at how well the government understands or has a database of people who are vulnerable. And for that, we have the National Socioeconomic History and the Vedas in Income Support Program, where there's a very good understanding of the vulnerable hotspots. But what the concern there was that there's still no detailed institutionalized mechanism for, let's say, VISP to trigger social protection mechanisms in case of a crisis. It has to be requested by relevant stakeholders, etc. Moving on in terms of gas and real-time hazard monitoring, that's due to limited coverage of observation and surveillance networks. So with our stakeholder engagements and through research, it was revealed that functional radar coverage in Pakistan is below 50%. And meteorological observatories cover only 97 out of the 170 districts, with automatic weather stations in just 40 districts in the country. In public health, the National Institute of Health established the CDC, that's the Center for Disease Control, in 2021, which advises on disease outbreaks and releases a weekly IDSR report, integrated disease surveillance report. But it could be enhanced with actionable recommendations such as preventive measures, what can be done, what a person needs to do in terms of the public or any kind of health outbreak. And more details on that will follow when my colleague will present on primary response. Last mile dissemination. So these are basically, as already discussed earlier, as well as about technical gaps and capacity. and lack of a last mile early warning dissemination strategy and institutional variations between different departments can compromise timely and effective warnings to vulnerable populations, even when disaster management authorities and the PMD are mobilized. Lastly, our primary concern is the absence of a national risk communication system for emergencies to ensure coordination, information sharing, last mile connectivity, dissemination of early warnings, and feedback mechanisms. The National Emergency Operations Center of the NDMA aims to centralize coordination between authorities at all levels, while it draws from successful models like the NCOC and the NFRCC. Its effectiveness during disasters depends on a supportive governance structure, particularly coordinating with provincial emergency operation centers or PEOC. Moving on to the entry point. So as you can see, in terms of the ranking, is basic. And for risk assessments, it's free that, as I've already mentioned, in terms of knowing what the risks are, the understanding is there. And with, but in terms of risk monitoring and warning, we are still at the nascent level. And there's a lot of, that means that there are entry points where we can quickly improve on that. So completing the remaining district level MSVRAs, at the moment the progress on it is led by the PDMAs and it varies across provinces. Punjab has done 20 out of its total districts. Sindh has done all of them. Balochistan has done 5, and KP has done. Glacial has risk assessments of 17 of its valleys. Also, it's not just about finishing and completing the MSVRAs and just putting them on some website or something, but it's also about creating capacity at the local level. But what I mean by that is at the district level, at the C level, and at the union council level for the locals, for the frontline responders to understand and utilize those MSVRAs and sectoral risk assessments. And that should be started by prioritizing the most vulnerable districts. Number 2 is about ensuring that all risk assessments, national level, district level, all those levels are there available, as Abbas mentioned as well, on a centralized and a digitized platform, so they can support risk-informed development planning and policy-making processes. And for the next 2 entry points, I would summarize in a way that in case of both public health and food security sector-specific aspects must be incorporated into multi-hazard risk assessments to develop effective preparedness plans. These plans should cover sector-specific stockpiling, for example, medical supplies and food, the roles of various responding bodies, and planning for surge capacity during emergencies. Lastly, modernization and capacity building of PMD means expanding and improving observation networks for accurate real-time data on weather, hydrological, and climate parameters, especially in remote and underserved areas. The World Bank's Integrated Flood Resilience and Adaptation Project, or IFRAP, supports this effort by upgrading PMD capabilities for hydrometeorological data collection, analysis, and dissemination. So it is important to assess the current state of weather, hydrological, and climate data to evaluate quality, coverage, accessibility, and competitiveness. There needs to be a thorough review of existing data sources and infrastructure, and the findings can be used to identify and prioritize actions for addressing those data gaps and enhancing the infrastructure. This is key because it can ensure robust support for impact-based forecasting. So we can't just say that we need impact-based forecasting, but we need to do this to get to that stage of impact-based forecasting. Yes, developing a robust last mile early warning dissemination strategy, which can ensure that timely and clear information reaches those at risk. That can be done by using various communication channels, not just limiting it to TV, but SMS, and more importantly, I would say the partnerships with community leaders and NGOs at the local level, which can amplify warnings and facilitate timely local action for predetermined response.
establish monitoring and early warning systems for livestock disease and pest infestations to facilitate timely response. And this one is important, it was touched by us as well in his opening, that promoting public-private engagement on advanced data analysis, long-range forecasting and last-mile warning delivery. This can include low-tech options such as community Wi-Fi radios that can reach remote areas. Collaboration on cost-effective, sustainable predictive tools for risk data collection and visualization, and exploring AI ML models to enhance weather forecasting. The examples were already given in the Next is about building a comprehensive national risk communication system, which includes establishing streamlined communication protocols between all stakeholders from the federal to the provincial to the district level for emergencies to ensure consistency, accuracy, and efficient coordination. And central system are proactive year-round public awareness campaigns on potential hazards, preparedness measures, early warning systems, and self-protection strategies, which can also help counter misinformation as well. So I will stop here, and I will invite my colleague Fahad to come and speak about financial preparedness. Thank you.
So when I was preparing for this, I was looking at some numbers. 2005, it's reported an estimated damage of $5 billion. 2 years ago, we did the PDNA for the 2022 floods. It said $15 billion. Then sometimes you hear these numbers and it doesn't sometimes mean much because it's such a large number. So the question is, who finances this? Where does the money come from? And how do you plan for it? And I think that's the crux of how we did the financial preparedness section. So it's split into two sections. Sorry. One is around crisis risk financing, and the other is on PFM. So, I think we've all worked on this sector. I know many of you in this room. We understand that the government thus far has an inadequate disaster financing framework. There are various instruments that could be at play if a risk-layered approach is taken, but somehow or the other, we haven't yet gotten there. Of course, I was very happy and excited to know that the NDRF has finally, the board has adopted the NDR strategy. And I think that's a great starting point. That being said, I think Pakistan has a litany of great legislation, great frameworks. It's the implementation, I think, where the game is won over most. In our review, a few things came out, and I don't think I'm saying anything new here, but one is, as mentioned, there's this inadequate disaster financing framework. We think that we have a starting point. The second is there's this limited risk layering. The impact of that is essentially the government of Pakistan retains all risk on their own balance sheets. And because of the tight fiscal constraints, planning for those risks is it's an issue. How do you plan for it? How do you make sure that you have the adequate budgets in place beforehand? In this environment, it's a big issue. How do you crowd in private sector to ensure that some of the risk can be transferred to the private sector? Insurance is something that has been talked about, for decades. How do we actually take the insurance ordinance? How do we modernize it to ensure that we bring insurance in? One of the things that I was looking at the most recent budget. I think finally we do have some dedicated budget lines for prices. I need to look into that, but I believe I saw something. Is it adequate? Maybe not, but at least once you start putting it in the budget, there's a budget line there. I think that in itself is a start, an acknowledgement that we need to plan for these things. So in terms of the entry points, I think first is quantifying, the contingent liabilities at the national and the sub-national level. And doing that really will help us, inform our decision making in terms of ex ante and ex post KRF instruments and what's relevant to Pakistan. Some things are relevant, some are not. Abbas mentioned that as well. There's some instruments that have worked in some parts of the world that may not be relevant here. There's some that are, and I think having information will help inform those decisions. Secondly, once again, also mentioned, at the national level, we're finally starting with the DRR strategy. How do we take that down to the sub-national level? And I think as important as having a strategy is, can we lay out an implementation plan? So who will actually do the work? What are the milestones? How will they be financed? It's fine to tell me to do X, Y, and Z. If I don't have the money to do it the next year, again, you will tell XYZ department to do that same thing. So will those things be budgeted? Let's make sure that we put it in a coordinated manner. And then in terms of risk clearing, there's many interesting ideas out there. You have contingency credit, for example, these SCAT TDOs. You have, reserve funds. Something that the NDMA Act also talked about. There's risk pooling. Also, NICL, for example, the insurance of public assets. That's something that we cannot have the discussion on insurance without having NICL in the building. And then taking it down to the community level, how do you de-risk communities? That's another entry point. Technology is something that once again, Abbas and other people have mentioned as well. So digitization, what would be the impact of digitization in terms of getting to the end user of insurance? And as well as financial inclusion. The discussion on financial preparedness from a sovereign perspective is one thing, but for example, the end borrower level, how do you ensure that people who you have brought into the financial sector, but they've been impacted by a climatic shock or some sort of crisis, how do you ensure that they have that resilience? One of the products that we have been talking about with the government is a climate risk facility for financial service providers. So if you ensure that, if you look at the PDA, the microfinance sector, for example, was massively impacted. Now, if the financial institution is impacted, they will not be able to originate new loans. And if you go by the theory which we do, that financial inclusion, it protects their borrowers and it gives them resilience. If the FI is not protected, then the end borrower as well will not be protected. So there are products out there that we can look at to ensure business continuity of the financial sector. And I think lastly, and I saw a colleague here from EA, I think we need to look at this is something that Yoko and Asad also mentioned in terms of capacity. There's been a lot of money that has been pledged, a lot that has come in. Are we tracking actually how much is coming in, how much is actually being used, how it's being utilized? I think a lot of people are tracking in bits and pieces. There are questions there if it is being centralized or not, because having a holistic picture would help us more. So in a nutshell, right now, of course, from a financial preparedness perspective, when you look at the combination of crisis risk financing and PFM, it is unmet. But I think that we do have entry points and we do have a place to get going. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Ali Mirza, I'm a health specialist with the World Bank team here in the Islamabad country office, and I'll be presenting to you the section on primary response. Under primary response, we primarily were assessing three different areas. We're looking at public health systems, critical infrastructure, and emergency management systems. And within these is where we have the granular details. And on the basis of this, our high-level findings are as follows. Now, before I get into this, let me just unpack it a little bit. Health is a very cross-cutting area. A lot of the sections which have preceded this, be it legal frameworks, financing, it kind of comes together when you do the response itself, which is where the legal frameworks underpin what you can do, who coordinates with who. This kind of links up with the primary response element. So within public health systems, now this is just a high level overview. Inadequate coordination, human resource allocation for public health systems, comprehensive national level inventory of critical public health infrastructure is missing, and horizontal vertical coordination needs to be improved to have a more coordinated and ultimately under the devolved setup, a more decentralized system. But let's unpack this a little bit. Within public health systems, Pakistan has actually made some very interesting progress. Pakistan's plans have been developed as a result of its involvement in, so, for example, the WHO's joint external evaluation geared towards pandemic preparedness, which means that a lot of plans and policies were developed, but their implementation remained kind of suboptimal. In terms of critical infrastructure, this is something where as one institution which does emergency response may have good knowledge as to what are its assets, where are they deployed. It doesn't extend across the entire spectrum of disaster response where other sectors are often involved. And more importantly, in terms of emergency management, just looking at NDMA and BDMA, their work in the past decade, be it floods, earthquakes, you can see that there's a fundamental improvement in disaster response capacities, but there's more to be done. Because you can put a lot of systems in place, at the end of the day, you need suitably trained HR to kind of implement all this. So this is the score for the primary response section. It's 1.5, but this is kind of deceptive because between public health systems, critical infrastructure, and emergency management systems, it seems low, but this is not exactly you can say that this is a very negative kind of a picture because the main problem we encountered here, and this is something that Amna presented in the initial sessions, that a lot of Pakistan's actually scored well in terms of having plans, policies, and legislation on the books. Whether it's absolutely tailored to the need in this day and age, it's a separate question, but the real problem really originates with how this implementation is done. So, for example, pre-pandemic Pakistan actually had a pandemic strengthening and response mechanism that they developed. It had been financed, albeit a little late, scale at which it was necessary, but some plans were in place. This included work for integrated disease surveillance, establishing laboratory networks, for example. A missing element was rapid response teams, which has come up in some of the earlier slides in the sections. That is missing. Pakistan again is leading the region, in fact, for having conducted its second joint external evaluation of the health, which focuses primarily on pandemic preparedness. And this time there is a renewed interest in rapid response teams. So this kind of gives you an overview that there are plans in place. Implementation is weak. There is a good idea about what needs to be done, but the HR may be missing. And while certain institutions, for example, disaster risk management is something that NDMA does have its in-house courses on, similar courses exist for the kind of focus that health would have. The kind of border security is not. There used to be an institution called Central Health Establishment, which is responsible for points of entry. It's now being retitled as Border Health Security, but do they have the kind of infrastructure and the kind of HR necessary to really do the filtration of the border systems? Health crosscuts. It's not only pandemic. It could be earthquakes, it could be floods, but it crosscuts a lot of the different areas, and you will always see health response going in alongside all of these other things. So on the basis of this, the key entry points that we have are 6. And of them, at least 4 are high priority and for which Pakistan already has a high readiness. As I walk you through them, you will kind of grasp that there is some of these things are actually not too difficult, and some will require a little more. And the other 2 are high priority but medium readiness, which means that the institutional framework framing a lot of the strengthening elements would have to be worked on. So let's just walk through them. So you heard from my colleague speaking about financial management. Now, it's not that Pakistan doesn't have financial laws on the books to channelize financing for emergency response. It was seen during COVID, it was seen during flood. We have earmarked funds in the kind of macroeconomic system situation that Pakistan exists. Earmarking those funds becomes a very difficult task when you approach the treasury. Nevertheless, whenever there is a crisis, there are laws and mechanisms on the books whereby you can transfer funds from one area to another. Developmental funds and transfer this to emergency response. But it seemed over our engagement with various clients that these mechanisms are subject to certain red tape, their bureaucratic processes. Once you are declaring an emergency, there should be some kind of legal framework to allow funds to flow quickly. Health actually had a major issue during COVID, for example, where these fund transfers were kind of delayed. We have seen that NDMA, being directly with the PM office, has a much more streamlined fund flow in terms of emergency response. Other institutions may not. So that's something to be looked at. It's laws may exist previously, they just need to be realigned. I'm going to jump ahead to health surveillance and intervention for human and animal health. Now, again, as I mentioned, Pakistan was one of the first countries in the world to conduct its joint external evaluation for pandemic preparedness and actually developed, I think it was the second country in the world to develop a cost reduction plan based on that, specifically focusing on priority areas which include labs and surveillance. To its credit, Pakistan has now a functional IDSR system. Is it the best? Does it need to scale up more? Of course, but it has been running. And my colleague who was describing the risk section mentioned the IDSR reports, the integrated disease surveillance. And well, it says response, but as we already know, the rapid response team element within the health sector is kind of missing. So the surveillance and integration across animal and human health has to be increased because when we talk about crisis, it could be a natural disaster, it could be mass casualty events, and it can be pandemics. So pandemics is a little easier because we just have so much experience. Now, the critical thing is that Pakistan, and Amna mentioned this in her initial statements, that Pakistan actually didn't perform as badly as would be expected under COVID. Its response was actually pretty decent. Now, some of the mechanisms which underpin that good response, and my colleague from risk also mentioned the NCOC, these were kind of ad hoc mechanisms which enable multi-sector approach. Within the existing framework of the government, there are links, but those links are weak. We've done stimulation exercises in the regional countries, and we realize that this is not just a unique to Pakistan problem, it exists across countries. We talk about silos. Silos do exist. They exist on the partner development side as well in the partner community, but they should really exist in the government sector. When you're looking at multi-hazard vulnerability assessments, when you unpack those, you automatically see that there are multiple line ministries and departments which have a role to play. So that kind of mechanism needs to be institutionalized. The sad part is that a lot of the really innovative mechanisms coordinate between the federal and the provincial to coordinate with different line departments, between disaster response, health sector, even the field staff at the primary healthcare level, so you could reach out really to where issues are. That kind of coordination, while it exists in COVID, hasn't been institutionalized into a mechanism which can be taken. So this is the other important thing regarding multi-sectoral coordination and the governance of emergency response. You may have heard my colleague under the risk section, Anila Yoko was mentioning certain disaster-related legislation. You may have noticed that the date was 1957, West Pakistan Epidemic Act 1957 was used, for example, during COVID times. A lot of the legislation has not got up to the state of the country today. We're living in a time of digitization. A lot of these laws need to be brought up to code and kind of bring them in line with the requirements at this day and age. So there was some impetus within health at least to develop laws and mechanisms whereby there would be easier data sharing of disease data between provinces and the federal. The integrated disease surveillance system is a step in that direction, but that kind of coordination needs to be regularized. We cannot wait for the crisis or for the different line departments to get together. Sometimes line departments who technically are supposed to work very closely together for health in terms of pandemics, say the seaports, the airports, and health, the coordination is very weak. The last high priority and high readiness element is development and implementation of climate resilient science and business continuity. Now, this is very relevant to our discussion here because we've just been through the flood. And I can quote the example from the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where 200 health facilities were damaged or destroyed as a result of the floods. Now, the interesting thing is that when we started unpacking that data during the flood response, we realized some of the facilities were actually damaged because they were placed in old dry riverbeds, zones which were susceptible to flooding, which basically suggests to us that the standards and codes which needed to be followed were not entirely. In fact, I would say that a lot of the public sector infrastructure is usually mandated to the public works department or the civil works department as it's called in Punjab. So they have defined codes, plans, POQs for the facilities that they build. And those plans were developed long time, and there is definitely a need to update those. As a result of some of the World Bank's engagement in Pakistan, we even developed a document which offers some guidelines for climate resilient health facilities. And our engagement really reached out to the public, the works department, and kind of presented to them what are the elements that they should be looking at in terms of the designs of their facilities, which reduce the carbon footprint by making them. There are lots of natural methods, some have been in use in Pakistan for centuries before we saw the change towards electricity dependent cooling systems rather than having traditional architecture which can contribute to climate mitigation in hot areas, be it high ceilings, wind catchers. There are a lot of examples, but the important thing is to know that the public works department needs to update its standards and codes, and they need to think about how we can, even citing a health facility or any area, if you know it's a flood prone area, you can reach out to the meteorology department, which again requires cross sector coordination, and figure out which are the areas where you will deal with flooding. I think Karachi through bitter experience has learned where the urban flooding predominates, and I believe the bank has also assisted the government of in kind of improving their drainage systems to prevent urban flooding. So that covers your high priority and your high readiness, because a lot of the elements over here are in place. It's just a matter of scaling up and strength. The other two are where the readiness is living. Now, that's the GIS-based national level asset management system. As I mentioned, if you ask NDMA and BDMA, they will give you a very detailed overview of exactly what assets they have on their book, what is their level of readiness, where are they deployed. But that's not across not the same case across all the other line departments and ministries which are involved in response. So that is a huge gap. I can actually quote to you an example from COVID times, that when the health ministry was trying to ascertain how many people are ICU qualified, how many beds there are, how many ICU beds there are, it was a bit of a tough job trying to list that data because such inventories are not usually made. And when the federal government is reaching out to provinces, even the provinces have to work hard to kind of collect that data. But having that data allows you to proactively plan and kind of define where you need to do, what you need to do and how you need to do it. And sometimes when one province has overcapacity and the crisis is localized to a different part of the country, there's some kind of interplay where one province can support another. I think the rapid response teams that are functional in the NDMA system are very adequate, but not so much in the other center. And lastly, dedicated disaster managers and human resource at district levels with facility training and technical assistance and resource provision. You can put all these systems in place, but unless you have people on ground to do the work, you will run into trouble. Now, I'll give you an example from our validation workshop. The NDMA does have, of course, for disaster risk management, but it's very focused to the areas that NDMA is not familiar with. When it starts bleeding over into, say, epidemiological work, or health-related work, or even contact tracing in case of an outbreak, you would definitely to have the right kind of people. Now, incipient kind of capacities do exist in Pakistan. NIH at the federal level that was mentioned earlier, as well as the Centers for Disease Control. They actually have, with our partner support from the US CDC, developed a course for field epidemiology. Now, this is, without this course, I can tell you that the response in COVID would have suffered because this provided you with a technical cover in all the provinces who could actually model the disease and contribute towards planning out and seeing where the spread is going. But this is just one area, epidemiology, or one area, disaster risk management. One of the silver linings, I would say, of COVID is that when we would talk about health in the provinces, the conversation always centered around doctors and nurses, which is how they looked at human resources for health. But now, post-COVID, now post-flood, even the counterparts that we deal with have a very clear understanding don't just talk to us about doctors and nurses, we want someone to talk about logisticians, disease monitors, epidemiologies, data analytics now. And the good thing is that there are always examples of success in Pakistan, whether that has been brought to scale or shared through some interprovincial learning mechanism is another question. Critical in this, I would like to highlight is Punjab. Punjab has a health information system delivery unit, in-house development of tailor-made apps for health requirements. Yeah, in one of our operations in Punjab, we have a joint cross-sector operation which includes the Punjab Social Protection Authority, which is very business-oriented kind of a mechanism. So the health and they've tailor-made applications which can be deployed at a health center but linked with PSPS systems. So these kind of capacities, if they exist in one province, can definitely be replicated at lower cost in the other provinces. So, but the thing is, this is because they have the HR on their books to staff such a unit. If you go look at the other provinces, you will hardly find anyone who does data analytics or even has a portfolio focused on disaster risk or crisis management. So while that score 1.5 seems low, the high readiness should imply that these are things which can be lower hanging fruit. Updating the internal mechanisms of government for better coordination, revisiting the laws on the books, the line departments own mandate to kind of review them in the light of the developments of the 21st century that we live in and bring them on today. So that kind of covers this section. I'll stop here and hand over to my colleague, now who's going to present social and livelihood support. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. I will cover the social and livelihood support section of the analysis. So this is just an overview of the gaps we identified during the analysis. A big gap is that there's no formal framework or a clear strategy linking social protection to crisis response. So while Pakistan has a very well-developed social protection program in the form of the Venus Union Support Program, which has been mentioned by my colleagues already, and it has worked during crises to respond, such as during COVID-19 and the floods, emergency packages were given to those affected. But there is a lack of like the system formally linking this, for example, with NDMA or this with crisis response. So I mean, so while you have a system, there is no way to, as I mentioned already, there is no way to actually automatically trigger it. You have to go through maybe formal processes, you have to have some ministry formally notify that, oh, now this can act. So so while you have like a very good social protection program, it's not adequately linked to crisis preparedness. Secondly, with respect to food repositioning and relief during crises, there is repositioning, as colleagues from FAO and WFP will know, during contingency planning, for example, there is food stockpiling. There is some provision for providing relief in the form of edible goods following the crisis. Often they're not adequate or they're not provided everywhere. Or for example, in 2022 floods, there were reports of the stockpiled food actually getting wet or getting damaged, or the warehouses getting damaged. So the coverage and scale of food needs to be. Following that, I mean, with respect to education, there are very robust education plans. We have the Pakistan School Safety Framework, which ensures that schools are prepared for hazards, man-made or natural. And there is, for example, the National Distance Education Strategy. There were a lot of strategies developed following COVID-19 when people were students were trying to remotely learn. So we have a lot of very, as has been discussed by my colleagues, we have a lot of very robust plans and strategies and frameworks, but there needs to be proper implementation and allocation of financial and human resources to make that successful. Lastly, like with respect to camp management and with respect to displaced groups and refugees, there is, again, we have some plans and strategies, we have camp guidelines, there is a 2014 policy with respect to displaced people during crises. But a lot of our mainstream plans, for example, the National Disaster Management Plan, they don't adequately account for the needs of displaced groups during the crisis. So while you have camp management at the district level and you have reports on how many people are currently in camps, there isn't enough mention of what about the differentiated needs of refugees? What about people who are already displaced? For example, from the 2022 floods, as of November 2023, 1.3 million people were still displaced. So we don't know the current figure, but this means that they were displaced for a long period of time. So what about those people? What if there's another crisis? Then how do you account for that? So that hasn't been mentioned in policies and plans. So these are some of the gaps that we identified. With respect to entry points, most of our entry points are medium readiness and high priority. So more needs to be done for their implementation, but they are priority actions. For example, there needs to be an institutional framework for implementing shock responsive adaptive social protection, an institutional framework linking NDMA with other the health departments, the Ministry of Food Security. So there needs to be an adequate institutional framework with financing. We also need to improve linkages between social protection and disaster management authorities, as mentioned. The best way to do this would be through a digital platform, a hazard database, a social protection and hazard database that links people who are vulnerable with respect to their socioeconomic status and also considers their disaster vulnerability. There's also need to recognize the differentiated needs of internally displaced people, so that they can be catered to, because during crisis response, you need to have a do no harm approach, and that includes considering groups that are already highly vulnerable, such as people who are already displaced, people who might not have ID cards, people who are landless, and refugees with Pakistan as a large population. So similarly, we need to include refugees in crisis preparedness plan and community consultations, because again, they are affected by these crises and probably even more so than citizens. So another action that is actually medium priority and medium readiness, because this probably comes after first we need to consider refugees and then we can consider including them in the National Socioeconomic Registry, which is used by the Ministry of Support Program for cash transfers. So if you include refugees in the registry, that means that their key data will be available to the government. It will be available to externally finance programs if they want to cater to them. And with respect to the food security, high priority, high readiness action is establishing an end-to-end food security crisis preparedness plan with dedicated financing. This includes linking the Ministry of National Food Security and Research to NDMA. This includes making sure that there is adequate repositioning of food. There are plans for relief provision and making sure that there are adequate stores of food. That's a big point, especially during the large scale crisis such as the 2022 floods, ensuring that there is a way to track and deliver food relief. And this also includes, by the way, agricultural livelihoods, because you have a lot of smallholder farmers and you have a lot of landless farmers who might need emergency cash or any kind of assistance during the crisis. So there needs to be that, they also need to be plans. So linked to this is developing and maintaining the database of farmers along with their land ownership. This can be done in coordination with provincial food departments, revenue departments, having a database of farmers, their land holding size, small and medium farmers, farmers who are tenants on other people's land, so that you're able to provide emergency assistance to them following the crisis. And lastly, with respect to education, as we mentioned, there are a lot of plans, but we need to enhance their operationalization scale, and we need to enhance the monitoring during crisis to ensure that they're actually implemented and that they're actually scaled up. So I think that's all. So before we move on to the way forward, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to come forward with them. We can connect it with us. Yes. I think we have a mic somewhere.
Assalamualaikum. This is Raja Masroor Hassan from Planning and Development Department, Government of Sen. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening presentations. I would like to ask for some clarity regarding insurance. Who has legal mandate to insure critical public infrastructure or assets? One, I have a few questions. First is regarding the legal mandate of ensuring public infrastructure and assets. Second is, if there is a legal framework, is this insurance sufficient for disaster risk balancing and financial inclusion? And thirdly, is there a need for some critical amendments in the insurance ordinance? And lastly, while developing and consulting and engaging with different stakeholders, did you go and consult with the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan for their perspective on the insurance policy and ordinances? Thank you.
Thank you for your thank you, Jay, for your question. To your last point first, we consulted, and in fact, we spent a lot of time with the ex-head of the insurance wing of the SCCB, who also was a CEO of an insurance fund in the past. So I think we met holistically with a lot of people, and at one point she also supported the idea. My understanding is that the NICL has the mandate for insurance of public infrastructure assets. It has not been able to fully insure those things. And of course, when you look at the quantum of damage that has come from all of these crises, it would be difficult, I think, for any one institution to ensure all the critical public infrastructure. That's something that we would have to review further as to how that mandate can be fully achieved. In terms of the insurance ordinance, I think it does need to be updated. I believe it's I don't have the exact year. I believe it was the early 2000s when it was last updated. Maybe there has been something since then, but the insurance ordinance definitely needs to be updated to incorporate the crowding in of private insurance into de-risking the government. In any case, insurance as a whole, I think the insurance to GDP ratio is less than 1%. And that's when we look at insurance as a whole. When you look at insurance in terms of disaster risk insurance, it is minuscule at best. So, of course, it's not just legal. There does need to be a capacity building of the insurers, also of the regulators. There's a full ecosystem there. But one aspect is the insurance ordinance that it does need to be. Thank you.
Are there any other questions, comments?
Okay, so if there aren't any further questions, I think we'd like to move forward to speaking about the ways forward and proceed to closing. So of course, we hope this kind of, the workshop has given a good overview of our analysis and the recommendation and entry points. I think some of these very more technical aspects, if you look at the technical annex, will have more in-depth analysis of the overview we have provided. And even the recommendations that we presented today are staggered in more refined action steps in the technical annex. So, we have prioritized high readiness entry points for policy making, future programming, and institutional strengthening and partnerships. So I think a lot of us in the room, from whether it's from government departments or development partners, we, as the World Bank, crisis preparedness is a priority, and we will continue to work with the government to work from a very cross-sectoral perspective. And we hope that everybody here in this room, the analysis has been useful, and especially the entry points will provide some pathways, whether it's for your department budgeting or for the development partners on programming. And if anybody would like to engage in further discussions and deep dives into specific sectors or aspects, we have a very large team. Actually, the leads of the sections are here with us today, but actually around 20 sector specialists at the bank have worked on this. So we are very open to having any further discussions, whether it's the insurance sector or food security or any other aspects, that we are very happy to work with the government and development partners in carrying these recommendations forward. So with that, I would like to invite the CEO, Mr. Bilal Saab, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues from the World Bank and the OP experts, for quite a detailed, comprehensive presentations, and giving all the technical details behind the compilation of this report. I think what we've heard is quite a range of aspects and the sectors and how they are placed in terms of their preparation. And then very clearly identifying the gaps and the ideas along with the entry points. I think we can always kind of argue, we can discuss sometimes in terms of the degree of the preparedness or the gaps which have been identified. But I think the key messages or the key elements to take forward are very, very clear in terms of the entry points. And especially I really like the layout and the design of the report itself as well, because it really talks a lot about the analytical part, but then it leaves the very clear entry points and the recommendations in terms of moving forward. So I think since Yoko and other colleagues already mentioned that it's a very kind of attractive group of people here, and that's how this today's workshop was actually organized and scheduled as well, in order to kind of having a kind of a feedback from the participants and giving an opportunity for you to kind of integrate and internalize some of the findings, evaluate them within the specific context and perspective of your own areas of the work and the work processes, and then see that where you need to work and where you need to actually collaborate and coordinate with other stakeholders and other colleagues as well. So I think this was the purpose of this today's session, and I really congratulate the colleagues from the World Bank and the experts who have actually worked on this and these consultation process which people have run. And just give me 1 second, I'll come back. And then for putting this together. So and ERMF, we've been working together with the bank and a number of other stakeholders as well. We see a very big ownership in the report. and a very big mandate from us to kind of take it forward and work with all the stakeholders who are in the room as well as who might not be in the room as well. So there's a lot of interest and many questions actually came in terms of insurance and the disaster risk financing and the role on the scope for the technology, what are the merits and the demerits, and what we should be realistically kind of envisaging and considering in terms of designing the different financing instruments in the specific context of macroeconomic conditions in Pakistan. I think this is all useful. This is the kind of information, this is the kind of insight which we are needed at this point in time. And then we need to take them forward and we need to kind of start working together a lot more in a coordinated manner. I think one message which clearly came out and it was so bold, it was so loud, that Pakistan actually stands very high in terms of the policies and in terms of the strategies. And we are launching, just like today, a number of policies and strategies, but the implementation actually still it lacks, and many of the policies and strategies do not really move forward in terms of the implementation. That's where we need to. That's where we need to kind of start working together, and that's where the coordination becomes very, very important. Bank can play a very instrumental role in that. Similarly, some other agencies they can really play a very, very contributing role in bringing all the actors together, seeking their inputs, and then converting all these entry points into workable items, and then move towards the implementation. That's what we're talking about. And the RMF is going to be asking a person very closely with the World Bank as well. So you want to say something? Yes, please.
Sir, my name is Nasir Ahmed. I am director of Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. I really appreciate the event, very important. And on behalf of senior management of Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, I would like to mention that during this population census, the BDS has viewed that 40 million structures in all over Pakistan. We have very important information regarding the infrastructure, where is existence of roads, there is a Pakka road, Pakka structure, Kacha structure, and where is the slab. You can identify very easily where the movement of, in case of flood, the movement of flood and the effects of flood, even in last 2022 floods, we have given a very important information and estimates of the damages caused by the flood. So I would like to invite the World Bank to please come up and work with BDS. We have very important information regarding any crisis which may happen in Pakistan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. At least I'm aware of, I'm sure that many other colleagues are aware of the recent census and the information and the data which you people have collected. Actually, we are in discussion with Gonda Saab from our end in terms of how we can overlay our NetCat data with the data which is existing in PBS, and similarly, I'm sure that it has a usefulness and applicability across many sectors, many regions. So, yeah, thank you very much, and this is extremely useful. So, I thank you very much once again, and I think wonderful work. We should give a big round of applause for our experts. Thank you very much. Thank you.